Why does a medical procedure that only costs 400 euros in Germany cost over $30,000 in the United States? So recent experiences have got us asking the question, why is healthcare so expensive in America? And so we want to talk about this subject, and we want to compare healthcare cost in the United States and America, access to care, and outcomes of care between the two countries. Now, I feel like we are uniquely qualified to talk about this because we have received care in both countries, and we've received it through a variety of health insurance plans. So we have experience with it. All right. So a few months ago, Betty was referred by her doctor in the United States to get an iron infusion, and so even though her doctor referred her to get this procedure and said she needed to get it done, we still had to send it. It still had to be sent in to our insurance to get approval from the insurance company, and that took a few weeks. And when it finally came back, the insurance did approve the procedure, and so the insurance would pay 80%, and we had to pay 20%. So our out-of-pocket cost for this iron infusion was going to be $6,000. So health insurance pays 80%, we pay 20%, so grand total of around $30,000, so $6,000 out of pocket. Well, so Betty knew that we were going to be back in Germany in just a few weeks, so she wanted to wait and see how much it would cost to get it done in Germany. So we came back, she made an appointment with an English-speaking doctor, went in, talked to him about her situation, and she got a full checkup. She had labs done, she had an ultrasound done, and he said, yes, we can do the iron infusion. We can do it right here in the clinic. But since you have American health insurance, we have to get approval before we know if your insurance will pay for it or not. So we just asked, well, how much will it cost if we just pay for it 100% out of pocket? And the answer blew us away. 400 euro. So that's like $410 to get this procedure done in Germany. That's going to cost us $6,000 after insurance in the United States. So why is healthcare in America so expensive? So the first myth that we'll talk about, and I think a lot of people overseas in other countries think this, and probably a lot of Americans think this too, but a lot of people think that, at least 50% of Americans do not have health insurance. And that's not true. The fact is that most Americans do have some sort of health insurance. But there still is a sizable portion of the population that doesn't have any health insurance. And roughly it's about 8.5% of the population in the United States has no form of health insurance. Now, I'll say before the Affordable Care Act was passed, also known as Obamacare, before that, it was about twice that. So around 16% of the population did not have health care before the Affordable Care Act. Now it's about 8.5%. Our health care we get mostly through our employers, right? So Americans get health care through their employer, the place they work. So if they lose their job for some reason, there's a good chance they could lose their health care coverage, which does not happen in Germany. Okay, and so even though most people in the United States do have some sort of healthcare insurance, it's still, the costs involved are still astronomical. As I just said, with our health insurance, for Betty to get an iron infusion, we were going to have to pay $6,000 out of pocket. So even with health insurance, roughly 66% of bankruptcies in the United States are associated with healthcare costs. So that's unbelievable. People lose everything because they're trying to pay for the health care. The second myth that a lot of people believe is that since we do not have a universal health care system, we don't have any, well, we do have government health insurance, but we don't have an overall government health insurance that covers the whole population. People think that the United States must spend much less government money on health care than any other country, right? Well, that's wrong. That is false. In fact, we spend a lot more than most other countries. We spend a lot more government money than most other countries on healthcare. And in 2023, the United States spent about 16.5% of its gross domestic product on health insurance for its population. And in comparison, Germany, which does have universal health care and has 100% of its population is insured, Germany only spent about 12% of its gross domestic product on health insurance. So the US pays a lot more government money on health insurance than basically any other country in this survey. And for further reference, Australia was the lowest, and Australia spends like spends about like 9.8%, so almost 10% of its gross domestic product on health insurance. So the U.S. doesn't have universal health care, doesn't have 100% of its population with health insurance, but it spends more government money than any other country. And so go back to 2017, in the United States, there was an average of $10,207 per person that was spent on health care for U.S. citizens. And that's a combination of government money and private funds. And to compare that, in Germany, there was about $5,800, so almost $6,000 was spent per person in Germany. And so Germany spent quite a bit less, and it has, universal health care. So these numbers just blow you away when you look at it. And so out-of-pocket expense in 2017, and this is the most recent year I could find data, out-of-pocket expense was $1,122 in the United States. So the average person in the United States spent over $1,000 for their health care. That includes health insurance premiums and out-of-pocket deductibles they have to pay. So over $1,000. In Germany, it was only $731. Okay, so the United States spends more government money and more individual out-of-pocket money on health care than any other country. So we must have a far superior healthcare operation in the United States than any other country, right? Well, unfortunately, that's wrong. The data says otherwise. And if you just look at access to care, now, when you mention to Americans, hey, we should adopt some sort of universal health care plan, a lot of people will say something like, I don't want socialized medicine. I don't want the government in my healthcare business and things like that. And, and I don't want to have to wait 6 months to get an appointment. I don't want to have to wait 6 months to get an appointment either. But the data and our personal experience says that is absolutely false. And to share a personal story, so in 2023, we were living in Spokane, Washington, in the United States. And Spokane is a city of around 600,000 people. And so, I had some issues and I wanted to make a doctor's appointment, right? So the first thing you have to do in the United States when you want to make a doctor's appointment is you have to check and make sure that the doctor accepts your health insurance, because not all doctors will accept all health insurance. So you have to check and make sure they accept you. So, I got out the list, I found a doctor, and basically I went to it was the largest healthcare organization in Spokane, and they happened to accept my health insurance. So, I called them and I said, hey, I would like to set up an appointment with a doctor. And I had no preference of who I'd be seen by. Basically, any doctor that worked for this organization, I was fine with seeing. So they told me that as a new patient, the earliest I could be seen was in 7 months. And I was like blown away. I was like, 7 months. And they were happy, they were proud about that. They said, yeah, normally it's like 9 months, but you're going to get in 2 months sooner. And I couldn't believe that. I was like, what, 7 months to see a doctor? And so if I had like a real urgent problem, I could go to the emergency room, or I could go to an urgent care clinic, something that's going to be even more expensive. But to wait for just a normal doctor's appointment, it was going to take 7 months. And I just couldn't believe that. So luckily, I'm a veteran of the U.S. military. And Spokane has a pretty large VA, a Veterans Administration hospital. So I contacted the VA hospital, and they were able to get me in the very next day. So, that was unbelievable. So, talk about, VA, if you don't know, VA healthcare is basically the epitome of socialized healthcare. It's absolutely run by the government. and they were able to get me in the next day. And I have to say that I have been very happy with my treatment I've received through the Veterans Administration as far as healthcare goes. So, if you don't like socialized healthcare, from my experience in the VA, it's been great. Okay, and so in contrast to my experience in Spokane, when we lived in Leipzig in Germany, which is a city that also has a population of about 600,000, Betty and I received health care through German doctors, and we had public health insurance in Germany, and we never had a problem getting an appointment. And typically, and we also had the additional requirement that we wanted to see an English speaking doctor, so we wanted to see someone in another language, but we never had a problem, even as new patients. And typically, what I would do, if we needed an appointment or whatever, or if we were sick, you get up in the morning, you call the doctor's office, or you could just do an online message and say, hey, whatever symptoms you have, what's going on, and they would contact you, and pretty much 100% of the time, we were either seen that same day or maybe the very next day, and had absolutely no trouble with it. We received some, I guess, specialized care, you might say. Betty had OBGYN appointments, ultrasounds. I had a few MRIs. I had physical therapy, dermatology, and things like that. And we had zero issues with it. Now, for a couple of the MRIs, or I think for one of the MRIs, I had to wait like 8 weeks for my appointment. So, but I didn't think that was really excessive, to be honest with you. So yeah, we used the German healthcare system through the public health insurance, which is kind of like, some people might say public health insurance is second tier. In Germany, you can get public or private health insurance, but we had the basic public health insurance, and we had no issues with it. We thought it was great. All right, and the numbers from this study by the Commonwealth Foundation, pretty much back up what we experienced here in Germany. So they rated the 10 countries that they evaluated, they rated them on access to care. And out of the 10, the United States came in dead last. And for reference, Germany was third in access to care. And the number one spot, the Netherlands was number one as far as access to care. And then they also evaluated the ability to get a same day appointment. And looking at this, the numbers, when you first look at it, the numbers look a lot better for the United States, but I think you've got to take a couple things into consideration. And so, for example, 53% of Germans said they're typically able to get a same day appointment when they contact their doctor. And in the United States, that number is 51%. So it's only 2% less. But a couple of things you have to think about. Number one, in Germany, there's no copay, right? So if you go to the doctor, you pay your health insurance, and you're not going to have a bill for going to the doctor. Whereas in the United States, even with health insurance, you're going to have to pay a copay, which could be $35, $50 or something like that, just to see your family medicine doctor. So you're going to have to pay a little bit to go to the doctor in the U.S. So some people are going to be reluctant to do that, and also you have to think about your sick days from work. A lot of Americans have very few, if any, authorized sick days, whereas in Germany, it's pretty much unlimited. So, a German, if they're sick, they can go to the doctor and really not have to worry about paying anything out of pocket, or losing any money from work, or worst case scenario, losing your job. Whereas in the United States, that's not the case. You're going to have to pay out of pocket, and also you have the worry about losing your paycheck, your day's paycheck, or if things come to worse, then you could ultimately lose your job, and then that's going to put you in even a worse case, because then you're probably going to lose your health insurance. And I think another issue, as far as sick days or sick leave, whatever you want to call it, in the United States, it can be, and I would say in a lot of places, it's very much frowned upon to go to the doctor during the workday, right? So you might get a real hard time for going to see the doctor. So a lot of people will schedule their doctor's appointments on their lunch break, or on their day off. They'll avoid going during work as much as possible. Where in Germany, from my experience, that was not the case. typically where I worked at, typically every day we would have at least one person who was out. Either they were sick, the doctor gave them a sick note and said, hey, you need to stay home, or they were going to the doctor. And, that was just a way of doing business. The administrators, they knew that on any given day they were going to have, probably two or three, maybe more people out sick, and they just were able to balance that and redistribute the workload so that it really wasn't much of an issue. But in the United States, that is not the case. If you miss because you're going to the doctor, potentially you may suffer a really hard time back at work because people aren't going to be happy with the fact that you're gone. All right, so the United States spends a lot more money on healthcare, both public money and private money, and access to care is limited. But when you do get to go to the doctor, then outcomes must be a lot better, right? Well, again, unfortunately, that's not correct. Basically, every metric you can evaluate, the United States performs below average compared to its peers in healthcare. Things like life expectancy, infant mortality rate, all those different statistics. The U.S. comes in pretty bad, if not dead last, in all of those. And we're not getting very good bang for our buck in the United States. Now, some things we do well in, like for example, if it's an expensive treatment, then the United States tends to do well in it. So cancer treatment, we do really well compared to the other countries in cancer treatment. Americans are normally able to get more fancy tests. We get more MRIs, we get more PET scans, we get more, expensive drugs. So stuff like that we get more of, but the outcomes really aren't better in the United States. Yeah, like all the numbers that matter, the U.S. fails to compare with our peer nations in healthcare outcomes. So why is that? All right, so where's our money going? We spend so much more money on healthcare. We can't get in appointments, and our outcomes aren't that great. So what are we spending our money on? So if you compare healthcare, this is going back to our personal experience. You compare the healthcare experience in the United States versus what we get in Germany. In many ways, it's much, I guess you would say, nicer or maybe more luxurious in the United States than it is in Germany. And so, for example, if you go to a hospital in Germany, you're likely not to have a private room. The service, I guess the service might not be that great. And some of the things that, we get in the United States, you just don't get in Germany. And, for example, if you go to the doctor and you have to take your clothes off, you're probably not going to get a hospital gown to put on. You're just going to be there naked during the whole time the doctor's doing your examination. So you're probably not going to have a gown. I've heard stories of waiting rooms full of women, half-naked women with their tops off, waiting to get their mammograms done because they just go in, take their clothes off, and they're not given a gown, so they're just sitting there naked. So you're probably not going to get a gown. If you have to give a urine sample in a German health clinic, you're probably just going to pee in like a Dixie cup and write your name on it with a Sharpie. Whereas in the United States, you're going to get a vacuum sealed sterile cup. You're going to have to rip the cup open. It's going to have a screw top on top, and that's what you're going to, put your specimen. But in Germany, you're just going to pee in a cup. And in addition to that, one time when we lived in Leipzig, I don't remember what I was being seen for, but the doctor called me and said, basically said, hey, we need a urine specimen. Can you bring a specimen into the lab? And I was like, yeah, sure, okay. And then I got off the phone and I was thinking, wait a minute, how am I going to take a specimen into the lab, right? So I thought, am I supposed to go in and get a, but no. So I called a friend of mine, an American friend who I worked with, and I said, hey, man, so the doctor wants me to bring in some pee. What am I supposed to bring it in? And, he kind of, his response is like, well, be a big dummy. Just get a clean jar, pee in the jar, and take it into the clinic. So that's exactly what I did. In America, that would seem so strange, and it seemed really bizarre to me to pee in just a jar at home. But that's what I did. And I won't even talk about stool samples because that was a real special experience, right? So yeah, you're not going to get a cup, you're not going to get a hospital gown. And so I had an MRI in the United States, right? And you go into the MRI place, and I was given had to undress. I was given a gown, and then when I went to the MRI room, they wrapped me up in this warm blanket that they pulled out of a warmer, and it was really nice. I was all wrapped up in this blanket, and I just basically fell asleep, nice and roasty toasty in the MRI clinic. Now in Germany. When I had got my MRIs, basically the instructions were, bring in your own towel. So you have to bring in your own towel and lay down on the table before you get your MRI. Now, Betty, she had a surgical procedure in Germany. And the rules for her instructions for her surgical procedure were she had to bring in her own pajamas. She had to bring in, I think, slippers. She had to bring in breakfast. They told her you have to bring in something to eat, after the procedure and after you come out of, after you wake up, you have to have something to eat. So she had to bring her own breakfast. And then they said you have to bring in, I think it was €8.50 cash. You can't pay with card. You got to bring it in cash to clean the operating room after your procedure. So, this would just an American just, or I guess, we live with it, but most Americans would they were like, what? Yeah, I have to bring in money to clean the room. I have to bring in my own pajamas. You're not going to give me a gown. So some of those things, that explains part of the cost of healthcare in the United States, because we have a lot of, you might say niceties, but maybe they're not necessary things to have when we go in for our healthcare procedures. Another thing that adds to our expense of healthcare in the United States, in addition to all the nice things we get, is the fact that we have a sizable portion of the population that does not have health insurance. So they have no way to pay for it. Now, these people get sick, they have accidents, things happen too. So if they end up at the emergency room, of course they're going to be treated, right? We're not just going to let them die because they don't have health insurance. We're going to treat them, save their life-threatening situations. But someone has to pay for that. So the people who pay for that are those of us who have health insurance, who go in for health care. And that's part of the reason why we pay more, is because we have to cover the costs for those who have health insurance. Now, hospital gowns, pee cups, cleaning the OR room, all that stuff is expensive, but it doesn't really add up to the full cost of why healthcare is so expensive in the United States. And you say you take those things and you say, okay, does that have a negative impact in Germany because they don't use those? And well, I mean, the numbers clearly say no, that it doesn't impact the quality of healthcare because Germany has better outcomes than the United States. Now, why is healthcare so expensive in the U.S.? I don't really know. There's, that's up for debate. There's different reasons. Some people might say it's corporate greed and everybody out to make more money. I don't know what the answer is. I'm sure that's probably part of it, but, who knows? But the bottom line is that we are not getting our money's worth in the United States. We are paying a lot of money and we're not getting very, very much bang for our buck, right? So what do you think? Are you happy with your health care that you receive in your country? Are you happy with how much you pay for it? Would you like something to change? What would you like different about your health care? And have you received health care in another country? And what was your experience like? And do you think it was better or worse than what you get at home? So let us know in the comments, what your thoughts are on health care. If you liked this video, if you thought it was helpful or interesting, please give us a thumbs up, leave us a comment, and, consider subscribing to our channel. We'd appreciate it. And join us next week for some more travel content, or maybe we'll just be talking again about life in Germany. But thanks for watching, and thanks for joining us, and hope I wasn't too boring for you. So we'll see you next week.